Hello and welcome to another WATG podcast. I am your host, Cory Jennerjohn, and I'm really excited to bring you the guest we have for today, Colin Seale. Colin Seale is the founder and CEO of thinkLaw, and I'm also happy to announce that he is a keynote speaker for the WATG conference October 3rd and 4th at the Wilderness Resort in Wisconsin Dells. So, Colin, first of all, thanks a lot for joining us. And please tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. I'm excited to be joining here at the podcast. Even more excited to be keynoting the Wisconsin Gifted Conference. So, um, I really feel like my story is kind of a reflection of what happens when we, as a system, determine that it's not okay to leave genius on the table. And I say that because I kind of grew up like a lot of the kids who we struggle to serve in our system, being on free and reduced lunch, having a lot of different challenges in a single parent home. And even my dad was incarcerated for a decade for selling drugs. And as a kid in that circumstance, I had this opportunity to get an excellent education almost by accident by being put into this gifted and talented program that changed the trajectory of my life. And now, after kind of thinking about this idea of at a very young age that brilliance is attributed equally, but opportunity is not, I get to do the work to create a space where stories like mine, where I was able to take this education and become a computer science graduate and teach math in Washington, D.C. and Las Vegas and go to law school and graduate at the top of my class and work at a big law firm and then start this organization, thinkLaw, where I combined it all together to teach critical thinking using real life legal cases in upper grades, fairy tales and nursery rhymes in lower grades, and do a ton of professional development and trainings for parents and families so that critical thinking is no longer a luxury good. I can go from a point where stories like mine are frustratingly an exception to the rule, but now we're in a space where we can truly create a world where all kids will have an equal shot at being exceptional. So that's kind of what I do now in a nutshell. Really try to make it so that access to critical thinking is equitable and we're able to really give our kids the tools they need to lead, to innovate, and break what needs to be broken.
Wow, that's really interesting. Colin, coming from a really tough environment as a youth, how did you become exposed to gifted and talented programs that, like you mentioned, a lot of kids don't have access to?
So here's the interesting part about that, Corey. You know, every year around the start of the school year, there's always these memes that start going viral about like how we shouldn't ask kids how they spent their summer vacation because some kids might have spent the summer vacation in Europe, some might have spent summer with abuela, and it might be traumatizing. And what I say is this: I say, you know what? Maybe some of our kids that went to Europe need to hear about that summer with abuela and the magic that happened there and the stories and experience that happened there. Because ultimately, when I look at my life, and I look at the life of a lot of kids that go overlooked and underestimated, their story is not a story of doing X, Y, and Z despite what they've been through. It's doing X, Y, and Z because of what they've been through. What they've been through defines who they are, how they are. When I grew up, I got to see my mom be a textbook in critical thinking on a regular basis, maximizing constraints, always figuring out a way to leverage resources. So if we start to kind of think about like that idea that a lot of what we're looking for in terms of potential might already be there, I can say that in my experience, the big difference maker was that I had someone in my classroom that recognized that I was getting in trouble at least once a week, but my behavior challenges came from a lack of being challenged. So part of our work, part of why this is so important, part of why I am a huge champion for expanding gifted and talented opportunities at a time where some people think that it's politically correct to contract those opportunities, to eliminate that. I say if we're committed to not leaving genius on the table, if we're committed to this idea of recognizing that we can stop talking about closing achievement gaps and start talking about shattering the achievement ceiling, is just a real great opportunity to change that conversation, shift that narrative. Because when we start looking at things from this gifted and talented perspective, behavior looks a lot different. Like the expectations around like sitting still and being quiet look a lot different because we wouldn't ask that of gifted and talented learners, right?
That's a good
So
point. Yep.
yeah.
What was your, when you say expand genius, Colin? What was your first reaction when you heard and saw that New York City was disbanding their gifted and talented program?
Well, coming from Brooklyn, that hit close to home, being born and raised in Brooklyn. But the other thing is, if you wanted to create from scratch the worst possible model ever to create a gifted program, that would be New York City, right? Like it's so ridiculous. In a city that was like, 80% black and brown kids, 20%, white kids, like the gifted program had like the flip demographics. They were only identifying kids at 4 years old. Things that were all crazy. Things that made it super clear that nobody had consulted or talked to anybody who knows anything about best practices in equity and gifted education. That said, you cannot tell me that there are not gifted children in every community, in every school, in every area.
Yep.
And the thing about gifted education that's really hard for folks to kind of wrap their heads around is that there's this duality. And sometimes in education, we have a hard time with that and. There's a duality. So I can tell you that phrase that some people want to say in defense of eliminating gifted programs, say, well, all kids are gifted. I need to just say that that's not actually true. When we talk about gifted education, we talk about kids who are gifted, right? It's a relative concept. And the idea is that we got a set of kids that are dealing with this kind of asynchrony where they're at intellectually, academically, compared to their age and maturity level, puts them at a point where it can get a little bit funky. And if they're not getting specialized training and services, they won't be able to be successful, won't be able to kind of untap that full potential. And the thing is, I don't have to lie. I don't have to say all kids are gifted. I can acknowledge that all kids have gifts and talents, but not all kids meet that actual definition for what gifted is. All kids deserve to get their gifts and talents enriched, nurtured, fulfilled, yes. And it's also true that there is not a child in the world who would not benefit from the kind of instructional strategies that tend to be reserved only for gifted and talented classes, right? So my view of this is a yes and kind of a deal. Like, yeah, like I'm a big fan of school models that have decided every single child in that school is going to have access to enrichment. Yeah, that's something every kid deserves. But you can't tell me that a kid who is at the sixth grade level in second grade doesn't need specialized support and services. So that's kind of how I respond to that, right? Just by taking it on and saying equity doesn't mean everybody gets nothing. That's madness. That's madness.
I agree 100%, Colin. What do you say then to school districts that say the biggest stumbling block to advancing gifted and talented or accelerated education is money or lack of funds? What do you say to that?
So let's talk about what that really kind of comes down to. A lot of times when they say lack of funds, what they're getting into is this idea that, like, hey, you know what? I think gifted, talented, advanced academics, I think those kids will be just fine. But we've got kids in special education. We got English language learners. We got kids who are academically behind their peers. And like, the resources that we have are very scarce and they should go towards people who are having more problems and more challenges and different student populations. And okay, if that's the presumption, two part come back to that. It's like, one, how's that been working out for you? Right? It's one of the things that I've actually got from like different coaching programs that I've been a part of like just checking the data. Like, this is what y'all been doing. How's that been working out for you? Two, I start thinking about this idea that, like, you talk about this thing about like who might need it more, but are you aware of the fact that you've got kids who are special education students who are also gifted? Do you know that you have English language learners who are also gifted? Do you know that you have kids who might be academically behind their peers, who might be struggling, who might be two grade levels behind, but still be gifted? So if we know all this, we recognize we got to have a broader model. And what I say is, you talk about funding. where is your money going to be more spent or better utilized? One of the concrete things I think about within this conversation around like, learning loss is if you've got a kid who is in third grade and is at a fifth grade level, right? In gifted education, we might do an acceleration model for that kid. We might use curriculum compacting and only teach them the minimal that they need to know in third grade so that they can kind of advance and get to where they need to be pushed ahead to their fifth grade kind of concepts. But we have a lot more in education. We have a lot more fifth graders who are at a third grade level. But what if it was actually the case, which it is, that the same acceleration model that we use in gifted could work for that scenario that you are trying to figure out right now? You've got funding for it right now. You've got learning loss ESSER funds right now for the same exact model. Why not use it to train more teachers in acceleration? Because if you got a fifth grader in third grade, then you can't have them doing all of third grade review, all of fourth grade review. You can't send them to intervention for all these times where they're doing all this drill and kill stuff. We got to accelerate them to the fifth grade level using just-in-time concept, thinking about what exactly do they need to know from third and fourth to do this lesson right here. So if we're doing, like we recognize that in a lot of districts, interventions don't work. The intervention system, philosophy, strategy is broken. Gifted education could be an informing strategy to raise the bar across the board. So that's what I would say. Use the funding that we do have more creatively so we can raise the bar.
That's a really incredible answer, and I agree 100%. There's some interesting news with you, Colin. There's a book coming out that will be published May 27th. Tangible Equity: A Guide for Leveraging Student Identity, Culture, and Power to Unlock Excellence in and Beyond the Classroom. So, first of all, what was the main inspiration behind this book?
So I'll tell you what happened. I had done Thinking Like a Lawyer, my first book, and been going around the country talking about closing the critical thinking gap and closing the critical thinking gap. And we got to do something about closing the critical thinking gap. And I forgot to ask a fundamental question. I made a presumption that I really did not understand that I was missing. I forgot to ask the question about whether or not our kids even have the psychological safety to be brilliant. Do they have the psychological safety to think critically? Or are they going to be in an environment where over here, I can be asking questions all the time and it's going to be deemed disrespectful? But in a different kind of classroom environment, me asking questions could be inquisitive and curious. Over here, I can be saying, hey, I don't think we should do it this way. We should do it that way. And I could be dinged for willful defiance. But in a different kind of classroom, that would mean that I was a leader and an advocate. So when I started recognizing that there was this gap, around the same time, we're talking about the moment of racial reckoning around our country, and folks started to approach me about doing like equity trainings. I'm like, I don't really do equity training. I train on critical thinking. And the more I started thinking about it, the more I started thinking and realizing, like, you know what? Access to critical thinking is equity. In fact, one of the things I could not understand, Cory, is that when you go across the nation, and I could actually pose this question right back at you, right? You go across the nation and you look at people, you look at school systems that are committed to equity, right? Like equity is in their mission statement and their strategic plan. And like you got teachers and principals that are committed to equity, heart and soul. Forget about the naysayers, right? Heart and soul. Why is it that sometimes those same educators still struggle with inequitable academic outcomes at the classroom level, with inequitable disciplinary consequences at the classroom level, with inequitable access to gifted and advanced academics at a system level? Why is there the gap between what people feel in their hearts and soul when it comes to equity and what actually takes place in their day-to-day?
Because because what we want and what actually the actions, because what are said and what are done are two vastly different things.
So, and you start thinking about that, right? You start thinking about what's said, what's done, and you start realizing there's all these other things that start to happen. There's like, like one more thing syndrome, right? This idea that if you give me one more thing, I'm going to lose my mind. So it's like, I can't just take on doing an equity plan as an extra thing Equity has to be the lens through which I plan for everything else. I can start to feel like, you know what? I like to call this other thing like the paper straw problem. Like I can't stand paper straws. Can't stand them. Like I love the environment. Environment is great, but I cannot stand paper straws. But you know what I hate even more than paper straws? The idea that I'm here with my paper straw and I'm sipping my little drink. It's getting all mushy in my mouth. But at the same time, there's a factory over there putting all kinds of chemicals into the air. There's that plant over there that's putting all kinds of toxins into the water supply. But I'm here at my paper straw, supposed to be saving something. So sometimes as an individual, I feel like what I'm doing in the name of equity is not enough. So when I looked at this book, Tangible Equity, I started to think about, you know what? What if we recognize that we actually had power? Power. We don't talk about power enough in education. But if we actually realize we have power, like I have power as a teacher every day to tell a kid, ask a kid, how are you doing? And care about waiting for that answer, right? Like I've got power beyond my belief. At a time where teachers are feeling more powerless than ever, you actually have a lot of power. And what if I could find out a way to use that power at an instructional level to create a different kind of system? The other thing that I realized, Cory, was that I spent a lot of time in my career talking about, hey, we got to make sure kids know how to play the game. Yeah, you got to know how to play the game. Like, hey, man, you got to do this way so you can play the game. But actually, the game is jacked up. The game is really messed up. And if the only thing we're teaching you is how to play the game, how will we ever see things become more just, more fair, more of a level playing field? So what I started to realize is it's not enough to actually train you on how to navigate the system. We got to give you the tools in your instruction to show you how to start to question and dismantle the system. We got to make it so that you're not just learning how to play the game, but you're becoming the kind of person that knows how to slay the game. So this is what we're really accomplishing in this book through instruction, through a very practical set of tools that can help you as a chemistry teacher figure out on a Tuesday morning how to redesign this lesson so that it gives kids more tools to lead, to innovate, and break what needs to be broken as a part of like something that doesn't feel like one more thing.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. That's amazing.
And I'll give you a very concrete example just to kind of make sure I make it clear, okay?
Okay.
Pre-calculus. People don't love pre-calculus, right? It's not a big thing
No.
around like, oh, I have so many great memories about being in pre-calculus. And one of the hardest things of pre-calculus is function composition, where it's like f of g of x and g of f of x, because you're plugging one function into another function. It gets very confusing. But you know what's not confusing for teenagers? Drama and conflict. And you want to talk about drama that is more polarizing than, transgender athletes and abortion and immigration combined? Whether or not it is appropriate to put pineapple on pizza. You can start a civil war over whether or not people think it's appropriate to put pineapple or pizza, or if pineapple on pizza is equivalent to genocide. I don't know how this happened, but I was watching this one classroom teacher talk about, I was looking at the student work, and students were doing compositions so well. And I was like, what did you do? I didn't even see really great notes. He was a first year teacher. They weren't making any mistakes. How did they get this so intuitively? Well, we did this whole example about pineapple on pizza, had a little debate about it, and then I asked them to draw a picture of what they think it would look like to put pizza on a pineapple. You serious?
What?
So you took who kids were, how they were, you took conflict, you brought joy, you brought discussion in the pre-calculus to deepen the learning outcome. You deepen the learning outcome by putting in the shenanigans that are already a part of their lives. So sometimes a big point that I made in my last book, Thinking Like a Lawyer, is that cultural competency is about more than like throwing the name Tyrone in a math problem. It's about giving me these opportunities day to day to be able to connect this content to my world, to have a relationship with my fellow peers and scholars as part of a scholarly community, and to in any way, shape, or form connect what I'm learning in school to the world beyond school. So that's a map that we really step through piece by piece in a very practical way in the Tangible Equity book.
Wow, that's that's amazing. I've never really thought about breaking it down to that level, like simple as pineapple on a pizza. Which, by the way, I do not like pineapple on a pizza.
My kids like it. My kids like it. It's not my thing, but yeah.
And lastly, gifted and talented and accelerated education, Colin. You talk about breaking it down, getting it to the core level. You know, moving forward in the future, what does gifted and talented and accelerated education look like?
That's a great question. I think what it starts to look like is, or what I would like to see it look like is becoming a lot less polarized. I'm dreaming of a world, Corey, where like, my best friend was like 6'4" in sixth grade. And it was an absolute no-brainer that he doesn't need to be playing basketball in gym class with kids that are barely cracking 5 feet tall. It was a no-brainer to have him go across the street and do practice and stuff at the high school. It was a no-brainer. It made nobody doubted that, right? If like somebody's doing backflips in your living room at like 6 years old, perfect form, nobody's gonna think that that person is gonna get to the Olympics without specialized training and support. If somebody's playing something off of the radio by ear on the piano with no training, no one thinks that that kid is going to make it to Carnegie Hall without extra support. I want to create a space where the way that we normalize supporting and nurturing talent in arts and athletics becomes something that's so commonplace in academics that we're no longer fighting this fight. And if nothing else, we recognize the equity component of saying we're not going to offer it through our public school systems. Because we got to understand that if we do not offer this through our public school systems, people with the means to get it are going to get it anyway. They're going to take whatever tutoring class, whatever specialized things, whatever, and it'll create this whole extra level of the haves and the have-nots that don't allow us to create an equitable norm. So that's what I hope happens, that we really detoxify this conversation around academic excellence and start changing that conversation altogether.
Wow. All right, Colin, I really appreciate the time. I really appreciate your insight. And like I said, we are really looking forward to having you as a keynote speaker October 3rd and 4th at the Wilderness Resort in Wisconsin Dells for the WATG conference. And once again, Colin, really appreciate it. Thanks a lot for hopping on the WATG podcast.
All right. Thanks so much, Cory.
Thanks a lot.